I call the member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Australia's biosecurity system is of pivotal importance, as we've been hearing from speakers from both sides of the House. It's essential, of course, for human, plant, animal health, the environment and the economy. But extraordinarily, we are still, or have been until this bill was introduced, we've been depending on the Quarantine Act of 1908. Now, that Act, of course, has been amended over 50 times, and there's been a number of reviews. But the point that then follows is that the bill has become clumsy, complex, unwieldy. There's a lot of repetition in it, so it's a bit like our tax acts. So this is the time. 2014, this new bill was introduced, and in 2015 we should have a world-best biosecurity system supported by appropriate legislation. And I can't stress how important that is for my electorate of Murray, because of course my electorate in northern Victoria depends on agribusiness. Agriculture, particularly our exports, are worth $39.4 billion to the Australian economy. That was in 2013-14. It was when the drought broke and our agricultural exports were able to once again flow through our ports that we were able to deal with the global financial crisis in the way we did. Our agribusiness exports are critical for this country's well-being. And of course, a good farmer who is being reasonably and viably sustained economically is a good environmentalist. Our environment, of course, is unique in Australia. We have lots of species which are not found anywhere else in the world. Numbers of them, though, are incredibly vulnerable to imported diseases and pests. You can imagine if rabies got into our native population, carried perhaps by the wild pig population, which, as the previous speaker mentioned, the pigs in Australia, the wild pigs, are indestructible and in almost all of our damper environmental places, and if they carried this disease, you can only imagine how it would infect so much of our domestic and wildlife. But there's foot and mouth, there's blue tongue, the whole range of diseases that we have not had in Australia, due perhaps to good luck, but I would argue to, in the past, scrupulous and careful quarantine inspection services. Then, of course, our marine industry has suffered from invasive pests and species like the crown of thorns starfish, probably brought in ballast water and released into the marine environment. We are still tackling that pest species, the starfish. It has destroyed a lot of our unique Great Barrier Reef and other parts of our environmental ecosystem. It could have been avoided perhaps if we had better regulation around the discharge of ballast water or sediment out of ships, either our own domestic ships or international ships. We have to be so careful of our marine environment because, of course, we're an island nation, but as well, a lot of the last remaining wild fish species are found in our waters. And then, of course, there's the human health issues. We know that we have been fortunate in being able to avoid the worst of the avian flu, of being able to so far, thank goodness, be able to avoid some of the crippling diseases that we've recently seen, like the Ebola virus in parts of Africa. But we have to be scrupulous and careful at all times in our inspection regimes and our reasonable and sensible regulation. I'm particularly conscious of what damage can be done when our quarantine system fails us or there is phytoterrorism. That's where someone actually deliberately goes about to allege that we have a biosecurity breach or a problem with an invasive species which will interfere with our trade. And I refer to the 1997-8 apple and pear fire blight scare. Now, Australia, fortunately, has never had the apple and pear fire blight disease, which inflicts most of our trading nations, our developed nations like the United States, New Zealand. This disease is found in much of Europe in its pome fruit industry or its wild related plants. We felt quite proud of the fact that we had not got this disease, and of course my area in Murray grows over 85% of all pears in Australia and over 50% of all apples. And so we're particularly concerned about keeping out the trade in fresh apples from countries who have this disease well established, in the case of New Zealand for over 100 years. You can imagine our our concern when it was alleged by a New Zealand scientist on a one-day holiday to the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, plucking a leaf or a twig from a cotoneaster hanging over a footpath. A cotoneaster is a host species to this disease. That scientist, without telling the Australian authorities, took the twig back in his pocket or his luggage or his briefcase to New Zealand, where it was inspected and declared internationally that Australia had in fact been not truthful about its apple and pear fire blight circumstances, because this New Zealand scientist had proof in his pocket that indeed we were suffering from this highly contagious pome fruit disease like they were and other countries. That announcement closed down the pome fruit industry in my electorate. No fruit could be taken to other states or exported. Over 2 million apple and pear trees had to be inspected by hand, one by one. There was an enormous investment in Department of Agriculture and local fruit growers in inspecting, checking all of the other host species in the area, like the wild rose bushes. Of course, nothing was found, but the cost to the industry of that season's lost production was extraordinary. And also, I would like to add, relationships between the two countries were shaken for a while when we had considered ourselves friends in relation to sharing in quarantine inspection standards and making sure that we were, as far as possible, soulmates in inspecting and keeping diseases out of our country, in respective countries. So I've experienced what can happen with a sudden announcement of a new disease, highly contagious, and one that we haven't before experienced in this country. It cost my growers millions in that one season. But we haven't just had that experience in my area. Just last year, we had an extraordinary circumstance where imported fruit, processed fruit, coming from China and South Africa, was making my local SPC and Admona fruit processing manufacturer non-viable. There was so much of this product coming into Australia, made so cheap by the high Australian dollar at the time and by the, at the time, more lax anti-dumping regime, one that the new Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture took a great deal of care in writing as his time as the Parliamentary Secretary to Industry and Manufacturing. We now have a better anti-dumping regime, but unfortunately this time last year the regime was not adequate to protect Australia's interests when it came to imported dumped product, particularly fruit in this case. But it wasn't just the economic damage being done to Australian fruit growers and fruit manufacturers. What we found, I should say, we, the National Measurement Institute of Australia, analysed the contents of 8 tins of canned peaches from China, and they found that the samples contained levels of lead way above those allowed, in fact double the level of lead allowed, according to the Australian and New Zealand food safety standards. And that was one sample. The second sample of the 8 contained 10% more lead than allowed. So one was double and one was 10% more than the allowed levels. These high levels of lead, of course, if ingested by humans, create serious health problems in the immediate and long term, including brain damage, damage to digestion, reproduction and nervous systems. And children and the elderly, the frail, are particularly vulnerable. You can imagine the concern we had when we found that these cans of peaches were on shelves. They had got through our inspection systems, and that's where I am concerned, that Australia does have a regime which hopefully this new Act will help us be more protected from, and that is where after only a certain number of inspections, say I think it's 5 without any problems found, you have a very significantly reduced level of inspection of product. This is food product, to see if it's in fact should be in an at-risk category. We've got to be scrupulous in the way we test for incoming food products. Our strictest food safety and hygienic conditions in Australia are not imposed elsewhere. And so while we can be perfectly secure and almost universally when we consume Australian product grown and manufactured in Australia, we have to be extremely careful when it comes from imported foods from countries where they have serious issues with soil and water contamination or different manufacturing processes and different regimes of sanitary control. I refer to the terrible problems that China does have, where, for example, 6 infants died and thousands were hospitalised with kidney damage in 2008 from milk adulterated with an industrial chemical. And that was known, unfortunately, it would seem, to bureaucrats for some time before it was widely published and made known, so parents could stop using this particular infant formula. It gets to be almost amusing when in 2014 fox meat was found substituted as donkey meat in numbers of Walmart packages that also were exported from China. I don't think we should be necessarily culturally insensitive in saying that donkey meat is a bit interesting in terms of contamination. You can have very pure donkey meat, I'm sure, but the problem was that fox meat had been substituted, and the suggestion is that that was because the fur trade in China had become less valuable, and so there was a lot of surplus fox on the market, and they turned into a meat substitute when their fur was no longer needed for breeding, ongoing breeding purposes. And then, of course, we have the issue of the government inspectors in China finding that in Shanghai, Husi food, expired and rotten meat was being used to make chicken McNuggets, beef patties and other products totalling more than 5,000 boxes. The official news agency Xinhua reported this, that 100 tonnes of meat products were seized and that police detained 5 people as part of their inquiry. That factory supplied McDonald's, KFC and other fast food restaurants in China and is a subsidiary of the OSI group based in Aurora. We have to make sure that our incredible standards of food security and biosecurity are also expected of those who import products into our country, and that our inspection regimes are sufficient to keep the Australian vulnerable, frail, elderly safe. I'm particularly concerned where you can guard yourself against certain products from certain places that you are aware of incidents of problems in the past. But if you are in a restaurant or in a nursing home, in a prison, or say in the Defence Forces where you don't know where the food has come from, then you're more vulnerable perhaps to people buying a cheaper imported food or beverage, and then you may be vulnerable. That's why our inspection services are so critical. That's why the electorate of Murray is so dependent, I have to stress, on good biosecurity services and a very well-working piece of legislation. So I strongly support this. We are at risk with things like the bees, with their potential collapse, our hives collapse if we don't keep certain diseases from getting beyond where they're currently being detected in some parts of the country. We have to make sure that our native flora and fauna is protected in our unique environment. I commend this bill. I commend all of those who've worked on it over many years. I also want to make sure that we don't, through measures of austerity / too much of the human capital, the numbers of inspectors, for example, from our inspection services, that would be a false economy, because they are, after all, the front line of protection of our country, our uniqueness, our human health, our animal welfare, and certainly, I repeat, our unique environment. I commend the bill of the House.